Well, thank you. I get the opportunity to try to keep you all awake after eating fried chicken for lunch and talking about the American Rescue Plan. So I'm going to do my best. Luckily, I'm loud and kind of laugh a lot. So hopefully we'll kind of keep this exciting. Definitely want to make this interactive if possible. If you can write down questions, I'll be around afterwards. Or if you want to shout them out, other folks might benefit from your questions. So I've already received several since I've been here. And this will probably stir up some more questions for you. So the American Rescue Plan is, yes, federal legislation that's passed. As of right now, there is a final interim draft of the guidance that's out. There's a public comment period through July 16th, and after that point in time, they are working to finalize the guidance. So everything I'm presenting to you today is what is currently in the draft of the guidance, but I hope that some of the changes that have been suggested by some of the federal level groups for the counties and like the National League of Cities hopefully get implemented to make the uses of the funds maybe even a little bit more flexible. So we'll see how that all shakes out. So I'm going to talk to you today just about the American Rescue Plan in general, the eligible uses of the revenues, and then I'm going to touch on compliance and reporting kind of at a high level. There are more slides in your packet than I'll probably go through in a bunch of detail, but definitely wanted you to have this as a reference document for yourself. If any of you have tried to read through the guidance, it's about 150 pages long, so it's quite detailed. And then the compliance and reporting that just came out last week is 33 or 35 pages in itself. So. And then the second speaker is going to talk a little bit about the Gfoa revenue loss calculator, and I'm going to touch on it just very high level as well. So the American Rescue Plan, the fiscal recovery funds are the local funds that are coming to state, local governments, tribal governments throughout the nation. We call them FRF funds, so if you hear me say FRF funds, that is what I'm referring to. So $350 billion of the $1.9 trillion package came to those units of government, and $130 billion of that came to local governments. That's counties, cities, and towns. The schools have their own separate kind of pot of money, and the state of Indiana decided to not include townships in the mix, so it's just coming to counties, cities, and towns. In addition to the FRF funds, on the right-hand side of this slide, there are several other departments of federal government that are receiving funds to be utilized for their efforts. And so under these kind of categories of, housing, small business, restaurants, and bars, it's just important to know that the other portion of the $1.9 trillion are going to all of these different federal departments, which we'll get into to be used for these various topics. So the eligible expenditure areas, these are just the general categories. The revenue recovery is a big thing. The individual, business, and nonprofit assistance is a big piece of this. Some economic development, some infrastructure, and then just working collaboratively on a regional basis is one of the goals. So for individual assistance, business assistance, and the not-for-profit assistance, the three categories at the top, again, FRF monies can be used for those programs, and there are some counties that are already in discussions about putting portals in place to assist maybe just businesses or businesses and nonprofits, for example, and getting small allocations to people who would apply for these funds. So that is one option. In addition to the FRF funds, all of the programs that are listed on the bottom half of this slide are also receiving separate monies, ARP monies, for these same purposes. So if you are in a county that is heavily hit by COVID and you need more business or even individual assistance, like rental assistance, for example, you might want to look into some of these other programs that are available that have funding as well. And most of the other programs, the ones that are listed on the bottom, in most cases are competitive programs, meaning you have to apply for them. If you meet all of their requirements or meeting their thresholds, then you could potentially get the grant funds. in the categories of infrastructure, public facilities, and schools, also eligible expenditures, and we're going to get into these in a little bit more detail. But again, the bottom half of the slide is what I think is important. Again, when your counties are coming up with various lists of projects that they need to fund through all of this effort, knowing that there are a lot of other programs and departments that are getting funds is important, so you can tap into those resources as well. Economic development and regional collaboration. The EDA, through the Department of Commerce, is getting like $30 billion of funds. So if your county has a project, for example, an industrial park, that they are trying to get shovel ready and fit for a company, or if they have a company that's on the brim of wanting to locate there, for example, and if you want assistance financially, the EDA program is a great program to look into for funding, helping fund that program. What we had seen through the CARES Act program, that it was only an 80-20 match, meaning you'd only have to match at 20 of your revenues. So again, if you have a county that is looking at that project example, that's one of many projects that EDA would be interested in. They want to see the production of jobs. So again, just layering all of your FRF monies with all of these other ARP buckets of money is the ultimate goal. You want to try to stretch those funds as far as you can. So just considering the community needs, again, for maximizing your opportunity. So what I've suggested to several of my clients, and I probably should have said what Baker Tilly is. We're financial advisors for local governments, if you don't know that already. What we have suggested to our clients is to form a committee of individuals, community stakeholders, maybe it's some of your electric utilities, for example, to come together and come up with a project list, again, to try to stretch these dollars as far as you can. So each one of the departments in your county is probably interested in a little bit different source and federal department funding opportunity. So this is a similar slide to what I showed you earlier. So this is a timeline of FRF monies, and I'm just interested, who has not received their monies yet? Is there anyone that have not received their funds yet? See a couple hands. Okay. So for counties, you guys are included as an entitlement unit. A lot of the cities and towns, unless they're larger, major metropolitan cities, are also entitlement units. Or the cities and towns, smaller cities and towns, are non-entitlement units. So you all get your money directly from the federal government, from U.S. Treasury. As most of you, it looks like no, because you had to log into their portal, put in everything about yourself, including a picture, and then you got the money. All of the small towns and cities within your communities are getting their funds directly from the state through the Indiana Finance Authority. They're the one that are governing those funds. They just released their guidance a week and a half ago, I think it is, and they can all now get on the portal and request the funds through the State Department. So if they come to you and ask questions, they can go on to IFA's website, and the application is there that they can fill out and submit, and there's also a step-by-step detail of what they need to do to get those funds. So it is kind of two separate streams. But as far as the timeline goes, I'm kind of going to work backwards. So originally what we had heard is that you had to have all of the money spent by 2024. Well, that has changed. The money has to be expended by December 31st of 2026. But it has to be obligated by December 31st of 2024. So you just have to have your plan in place as far as how you're going to actually spend the monies. But if you're doing a sewer project, for example, that has a little bit longer project timeline, knowing that you can go beyond that 2024 date is going to be very important as far as getting those funds spent. Some other things, March 11th was when ARP got signed into law, and then March 3rd is when the performance period begins for the various reporting requirements. So it's slightly before the final rule was rolled out. But the March 3rd period will be important when we start talking about the compliance and reporting side of things. So the tranching of the funds, I think most folks know now about the NEUs, the non-entitlement units, versus the entitlement units, which includes all of you. That there are portals that you had to go onto, again, to get the funds. As far as the payment logistics, you received 50%, and 1 year from the day you actually receive the monies is when you'll get the other 50% of the funds to spend. So as far as the usage of the funds categories that came out in this initial draft guidance, public health and economic impacts from COVID is the first one. So your response to COVID, what that was impacting on you, any negative economic impacts that it might have had, and then providing relief to low income Native American communities. Within that, responding to COVID-19, we'll talk a little bit about the whole premium pay side of things, which I'm assuming some of you all have some questions on. So we'll hit that. Number 2 is revenue loss, and then the third piece is infrastructure. So as far as responding to COVID-19, so kind of the last point is pretty much anything you can say was due to COVID. Like if you could say this happened due to COVID, more than likely these funds can be utilized to use. You always want to make sure that you get your legal counsel's like final blessing, that they feel like it falls within the guidance that's provided. But any operating expenses, so if you had to put any mitigation pieces in, all the hand sanitizing stations you had to put in, for example, you can get reimbursed for that. Any capital investments, there were some people who actually built or like renovated spaces into getting the vaccination sites, any medical facilities, those funds can be used to reimburse for those. And then anything that was allowable really underneath the CARES Act funds, again, fall within what these funds can be used for. As far as the response to negative economic impacts, so again, this could be individual assistance, so food, their housing, utilities, burial assistance, some job training are just a few of those kind of individual assistance pieces that you guys are able to use these monies for, if that's what you choose. The small business and nonprofit assistance, again, I talked about earlier, is something, again, where you would put a policy in place that, business could come apply, maximum they could get would be this number, to help with their losses due to COVID. And you can make that as restrictive as you would want. If there's a certain industry that you felt like was most hardest hit in your county, then you could even make a policy related just to that. And then the last point is to aid any impacted industries, such as tourism and travel. So if you're one of those communities, these funds can be utilized to help infill some of those lost revenues. And I would say on the nonprofit assistance on the last slide, we've heard some communities have certain line items for nonprofits that come into their county budget. Well, those nonprofits are going to be the first ones that they're going to help because they weren't able to have their annual fundraisers, so then therefore they were hard hit. So again, just some examples of things to kind of start thinking through as far as how big of a look you have on this. To continue on with some negative economic impacts, any services that you provided for unemployed workers, payroll, covered benefits, and other costs associated with rehiring public sector staff up to pre-pandemic levels. Deposits into state unemployment trust fund up to pre-pandemic levels. And then basically, again, if anything is due to COVID or related to COVID, more than likely these funds can be utilized for those purposes. As far as low income, I would just say that one of the goals from the federal government for COVID is to help the hardest hit communities. And so this slide basically just says, again, pretty much anything with your lowest and hardest hit communities could be used to help with any public health issues that you might have that you've had to fund. If you need to invest in housing and neighborhoods, there's a big piece on that. Educational disparities. So if your community didn't have access to get iPads or technology out to some of the individuals who are trying to do school from home, just again, those type of examples. As far as the premium pay goes, so the premium pay is for essential workers. This is just kind of a summary slide, and then I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. But essential workers would be healthcare, public health, retail, janitors, any childcare folks. And then as far as the limitations, as far as paying them, so the requirement on the right-hand side is really that those folks were still there. They were still working, through the pandemic. And in some cases, we've heard they just were not able to be paid. In some cases, some counties want to give some premium to them to just kind of thank them for being there during the very tough time. And so these funds can be provided retrospectively to the workers if you don't feel like they were compensated adequately, if you decide you want to use your funds for that. The limitation by the piggy bank is that it can't exceed the $13 per hour, and it can't exceed $25,000 per worker. And there's, again, just a couple more slides with a little bit more detail. It is explicit that if employees who are considered essential were able to work from home, that they are excluded from this premium pay allowance. There's a little bit more detail on the limitations on the payment for them. And just a little bit more detail, again, on premium pay. The last bullet point is that third-party employers and contractors of essential workers are eligible to receive grants for that essential work. So if you had a vendor of, like your commissary, for example, in your jail that was providing and wasn't able to provide or had to kind of go out of their way, and you want to give them a grant for a premium pay, that would be one example. All right, so the second thing is the revenue loss calculation. Again, there's going to be a second portion of this session that goes over the Gfoa's revenue loss calculator that's put in place, which I highly recommend if you are planning to do the calculation on your own to utilize the template that Gfoa did roll out. I do know that if you go to the IFA's website, the Indiana Finance Authority's website, that they do have a link to the Gfoa calculator or template on their website. Otherwise, you do have to have a membership with Gfoa to get it. So I was pleasantly surprised to see it publicly available there for everybody to utilize. So in that template, you'll see, and as the recording later will see, is a line item detail of all of the various revenues that you have coming in. And then you would fill in the various revenues based on the various years, which we'll talk about here quickly. And it then highlights the funds that are to be excluded. So there are certain revenues, like the first bullet point, that should be included, like your taxes, any miscellaneous and intergovernmental transfers from state and local government funds. One question I got earlier were gaming revenues. Gaming revenues should be included in that calculation. But there are exclusions as far as taking out revenues from those line items. So that will be refunds, correcting transactions, federal government transfers, utility revenues. If you had a bond that was issued, if you have a construction fund, any kind of like one-time revenues are a part of that kind of detailed guidance as far as what should be removed from your calculation. The calculation, it's very important to know, is an entity-wide basis, meaning you can't just look at just your general fund or just your income tax fund or just your gaming revenue fund. You have to look at all funds in, all revenues in, including all your miscellaneous revenues and everything. So one challenge is kind of breaking down the miscellaneous revenues detail, which hopefully you all have. The calculation there is a provision for a growth adjustment of 4.1%. That is the minimum. So if you are under it, you bump up to 4.1%. And then that 4.1% can be increased. You have to look at like 16, 17, and 18. And if your average growth of your revenues exceeds 4.1%, you use the higher number to as a part of your revenue loss calculation. And again, she's going to go into more detail, so hopefully it covers maybe some questions you get. But you compare the actual revenue earned as of December 31st of 2020 through 2023. So it is a calculation you will update each year, and it's a rolling calculation that you'll update each year. And then as far as so your revenue loss, so basically you'll end up with a number. This is what our revenue loss number is. I would say that we have done a handful of counties calculations already and actually haven't seen a whole lot of revenue loss because, again, you're looking at every single fund. So each individual case, though, you all need to do the calculation just to make sure you have it or not. Because on number one underneath allowed, the usage of the FRF funds for your revenue reduction can be used for any government services. So if you determine whatever your revenue loss number is, that portion of your FRF funds you can use for any government services. So this is where the gray area comes in, where you want your lawyer's blessing to make sure that they agree that it's government services. But that's where you get into, if you do have a loss, then you can use that portion of the funds for maintaining or building new infrastructure, cybersecurity, if you have health or public safety needs. So that portion of your revenues would be much more flexible. As far as what it's not allowed for is you can't pledge any of those funds towards debt service. You can't replenish any, if you have a debt service reserve fund that's short, you can't replenish those. You can't put it in your rainy day fund, unfortunately. But so if you do come up with a revenue loss number, it is most flexible in its use, which would be a good thing. As far as the revenue loss calculation goes, I know I've received several questions just today about when do we do that calculation. You can do it now because you're going to compare 19 to 20 revenues in your first round for this year. So if it's something you want to go ahead with, go for it. I know we're assisting several counties already and cities and towns with that calculation. So there's nothing that is holding you back from doing that calculation now. Does anybody have any questions? We have kind of cruising through this rather quickly. Stop with any questions. Do I need to have everybody stand up and listen to me standing up? Fried chicken setting in. You can start spending now if you want. So your fund, the fund that you all set up to receipt in these monies, you have to do appropriations out to spend the monies and have a plan to spend the monies. So my suggestion number one would be, and it's kind of simultaneously to you doing the revenue loss calculation, is for the county, that committee that I referred to, coming up with a list of projects and to kind of force the prioritization of what you want to do first. County units of government, each one of you are getting a pretty significant amount of monies. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity, to work with some of your local governments within your county even to pair up the funds to do a little bit larger projects. So if you have like a regional sewer project that you would want to do, that each of you could maybe have a piece of making that project happen. So I would say, yes, you can spend the funds, but I think you just need to be very strategic about making sure that you are spending the funds on projects that are going to have a greater long-term impact and hopefully bring, assessed value or more income back to the county would be the ultimate goal, besides just running out and spending it on various things. Some other allowable expenditures that you probably all have heard about are water and sewer infrastructure. So here, basically any projects that are eligible under the Clean Water and Drinking, safe drinking water funds can be, the FRF funds can be used on those type of projects. So here's a list of various types, including stormwater, which is often a question we get. For this, recipients may not use funds as a state match for the Clean Water SRF or the Drinking Water SRF program. So I think that's important to know. You can use FRF monies, though, to match state grant programs. You cannot use these FRF monies to match federal grant programs, though. And you just have to be careful if the state grant program at the state level is funded by ARP monies, then you can't use it for an ARP, for you to match ARP monies, because that would technically be double dipping into the ARP bucket. So if you had a community crossings project, for example, and you wanted to match, if it was eligible and you wanted to match it, then you would be able to do that, for example. Yes? That is my understanding, that it is public projects. And that's what I would check with your lawyer on that, just to see if there's a way they could figure out how to do it. I think when you get into the private world, it's going to be a little bit tricky with funding any type of private projects. Mm-hmm. Of course. In addition to water and sewer, broadband infrastructure is one large piece of this. I do know of all of the state ARP monies that the state receives, that they also have a huge chunk of funds that are going to be spent towards broadband. So if you are in the midst or getting ready to start a broadband project, just be sure to look into both. For the broadband infrastructure, the bullet point number 1, the guidance says the improvements must be readily deliverable to a minimum speed of 100. So just know, again, if you're in a broadband situation, that the speed of the internet does matter. There's an exception if it is extremely difficult, basically, to get it to your community because of all of so many varying factors, that the speed limitation goes down to 20. So if you are in a more rural community, it's just hard to get there. Just know that as well. So it's just a question you should be asking to your providers. It should be designed to benefit underserved households. So those folks, again, who had kids who were trying to do virtual school and didn't have access to internet, those would be the first people that you should be trying to tap into or get connected. And then it can also be used for modernization of cybersecurity, including the hardware, software, and all those various items in the last bullet point. But again, it does have to be used as a part of COVID, due to COVID. I'm cruising through this. Anybody have questions there? Can I ask a question? Raise your hand if your county has formed a committee related to ARP and how to spend the funds. One question we've received a lot is, will it cover our costs? For example, administrative consulting cost, if you have anyone, and it does. Some ineligible expenses listed here. So pension deposits, it cannot be used for. The bottom left, it cannot be used to match federal grant programs, which I just mentioned. The top right, may not offset a reduction in net tax revenue as a result to the law change or administrative interpretation, meaning you can't implement these funds to adjust your rate for 1 year. And long term, you wouldn't want to do that anyways because the revenues are one time. And then ineligible expenditures would be anything subject to provisions in the uniform guidance, including cost principles. So again, kind of coming back to timeline, now that you have kind of walked through all of these eligible expenses and uses of the funds, the cost must be incurred beginning on or after March 3rd. They must be incurred and obligated by by 2024, and then expended by 2026. And then one thing I did want to point out is a question that I've gotten a couple times already is whether or not the FRF funds can be invested. And yes, they can be invested. So because there's a window of time here in which you don't need to necessarily race and spend the monies, you need to be planning and thinking through how to, again, stretch those dollars as much as you can, invest your funds. And because all of you, again, are getting a large sum of money, you need to invest your funds. The interest that's generated from that investment, from the guidance we've seen and what we've seen from State Board of Accounts, is that one, you can gain it. Two, you do not have to report it to Treasury. And three, it goes into the general fund, or basically you can do a resolution to determine what fund it should go into. And that interest, the revenue from that, can be used on anything like the general fund would be used on. So I would anticipate we might get some more clarification around that, but again, that's what we have seen, meaning it does not have to be used for ARP-related eligibility purposes. So in those first few things, again, revenue loss calculation, come up with your plan, invest your funds would be the first three things kind of out of the gates, I would suggest. To get into compliance and reporting a little bit, again, this guidance was just published on the 17th of June. It's 33 pages long, and there's the website there if you need some nighttime reading to get you to sleep at night. It's long, it's detailed, so I'm going to do my best to summarize it here for you. So maybe to start from the right-hand side. So the right-hand side is going to tell you who is required for this reporting, each one of these various reporting requirements. So there are 4 different reports that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is the interim report that is due by August 31st of this year that you all have to do. So again, states, the large cities, counties, and tribal governments are required. Those are the entitlement units that are getting funds directly from the U.S. Treasury. So you have to do this interim report, and it is a report of expenditures by category at a summary level from when you receive the monies until July 31st of this year. And then states, like the state level government, they have some additional reporting requirements. We have heard and we've been told by Treasury that they are coming out with a user guide and templates. So we do anticipate they are going to roll something out. Obviously, it's July 13th, and August 31st is going to be here before we know it. So I would just say kind of keep your eyes and ears open for the Auditors Association and maybe Baker Tilly or whoever you might get your sources of information from to let you all know that they are out there and available. I mean, us internally are even like, do we need to come up with something? Where are we going to end up here? So we do know some of the reporting requirements and what they look like for the CARES Act. So we anticipate maybe it's going to be similar, but we'll see. The second report are quarterly reports. Again, this is for you all. The first quarterly report is due October 31st. Happy Halloween. And it should include financial data, information on any contracts and subawards that you are giving over $50,000. So again, if you are going to get into that business grant program or nonprofit grant program, for example, it would include that. The types of projects that have been funded, and then any other information regarding the recipient's utilization of the funds. basically a summary of how you're using the funds. The initial report will cover 2 quarters from the date of the award to September 30th of this year. And then going forward, and is why I gave you they gave you a printout. The right-hand side is a chart of when those quarterly reports would be due. So just some guidance for you there. And then the annual project and expenditure reports. So these are for those NEUs, those non-entitlement units. So those cities and towns that come and ask you questions often, they'll have to be responsible for an annual report. And it's due October 31st of this year as well, even though there are several units that still have not received those funds yet because the guidance just came out from the state. So those reports will cover the activity again from receipt of the award to September 30th. And those will be due each year by August 31st going forward. And then the last report affects you all. It's called an annual recovery plan. So basically you're going to have your interim report that's due one time now. Then you're going to have your quarterly reports, and then you're going to have a one-time annual report that you are all responsible for. And this has the descriptions of the projects that were funded, that have been funded, and then information on performance indicators. And this, again, is where we are expecting some more guidance to come out on the performance indicators and objectives on how you spent the funds. And there is more detail in that 33-page guidance, so that might be a section you do actually want to go read as far as what that performance indicator means. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail here in just a second. So the first performance report is what they're calling it, is due August 31st of this year. And then going forward, they will be due within 30 days after the 12-month end period. And this one, I guess the performance report, I probably want to get some clarification on it, but it is for populations over 250,000. So it might not be required for some of you. So here's just some more detail on that project expenditure report. And again, I hope the recording doesn't get into too much of this so that you're not totally overwhelmed with it 2 times. But so the required information for the annual project and expenditure report would be for the projects, any new and existing eligible government services or investments that have been funded by your FRF money. And then it even shows there, like the description includes your project name, if you have a project ID number, the expenditure category that it would fall under, for example, like COVID-19 or infrastructure, are just 2 examples. And the expenditure categories are also in that compliance guidance that I provided you the website link for, so you have that. In addition to the projects, the expenditures made for each project. C is the project status, meaning where is it at, if it's 50% complete, 100% complete. The project's demographic distribution is also required as far as where it's located in the qualified census tract and other various items listed there. For subawards, any contracts or grants awarded, again, over $50,000 need to be recorded and reported on. Civil rights compliance, not sure exactly what all that entails. And then required programmatic data is kind of the annual, that number-driven information that you'll have to provide. So, again, this guidance just came out, so I'd anticipate you'll see more information coming down the pike on it. On the next page, on H, there's just a little bit more required programmatic data for if you have infrastructure projects that you are funding with your FRF monies. So the page numbers that I have listed there, page 21 and 22, are the page numbers in that guidance manual that is on the Treasury's website that I provided you the link for. So if you want to read through that a little bit more. The distribution to the NEUs, again, that does not affect you all. That's the non-entitlement units. And then there's various documentation that's required for the non-entitlement units. So it might seem overwhelming. There's lots of details. If you have ever received federal money, there are hoops you always have to jump through. But it's free money that you need to utilize. And so, it's just one part of receiving these funds. So NEU stands for non-entitlement unit. So those are going to be your cities and towns, smaller cities and towns. So I'd say if you are responsible for the compliance side of things, which I assume most of you are, you might actually need to read through that 33-page document just to make sure that you know all the details and you can highlight it. So it's actually quite succinct for something that's coming out of the Treasury. So any questions right now? Yes. So there is, if you flip back to slide 28, this website link I have on the bottom of slide 28 is the direct link to the guidance for the compliance and reporting. So you would just need to go there online and then go to page 21 or 22 or 16, whichever one it is that I reference. So you're more than welcome to print it out. They do have a PDF or a printing capability. So I can hear some chatter, so I can tell there might be some questions. If you have the question, someone else more than likely has a question, so don't hesitate if I can answer it or not. As far as preparing, again, on how to spend the monies, I know I've kind of talked about it throughout my presentation just because I feel pretty strongly about it, is, again, you don't have to obligate the funds until 2024. So taking 6 months or whatever it may be to spend to actually plan for these projects is very important. Again, that you are making longer-term impacts on your community than just kind of one-time, one-off expenditures kind of here and there. So work with your other local communities to do projects that you might have in the queue. And then, again, just trying to utilize other ARP buckets of funds, again, is something you want to look into. And the next slide is just a little bit more detail. If you haven't started with your FRF monies besides setting up the fund and getting the funds into your account, it's just kind of a checklist of where to start if you need some guidance. One thing that may not be that new to this group is but again, if you are a source of information for your cities and towns, any unit of government that gets $750,000 or more of federal monies does have to have an audit done. And so some cities and towns most definitely have not had audits done. So I just wanted to be sure to point that out. It's number 9 on this list. We do have some information available to you if you are interested in accessing it. So I just provided you our website. And we do podcasts and webinars as we find out more information. And with that, I am done a little bit early. So again, if I can answer any questions, or I don't know, Vicki, if we want to go into the next thing, and if there's questions maybe after that, then we can answer them as well. Yes. Yeah, so I would say, so the question was basically, is there who to go to ask questions? So for you all, AIC would be a good resource. The County Auditors Association probably shooting out information when they receive it. If you use a financial advisor, in most cases, I would assume that they're tracking the act. We have a whole team on staff that is focusing on this just because there's so much depth to it. And two, just because you guys have such a pulse on everything going on in your communities, you know if your local businesses are hurting, they might even come to you saying, hey, what can we do? So knowing that there's an ARP bucket of money for restaurants, for example, then those businesses' accountants can go out and look into getting some of these grant opportunities. Or if you have a grant writer in your community too, I know that there are several of those, either hired by the county or contracted by the county, would be a resource. You all also have my contact information now, so feel free to shoot me questions if you have them. If I don't have the answer, then I can sure get the answer for you from the team of folks that are working on it. I will say, I know for the NEUs, you know, we've had some towns come to us and basically say they don't want the money, they don't want to deal with it, they don't want the money, and so one thing that did come out in guidance is that if communities, I know this for any use, so the small cities and towns, if they decline the money, they can decline the money, and those monies will get redistributed in potentially another round of distribution to all of the units that do want those funds. So it's my hopes that that doesn't necessarily happen and people get creative on how to use the funds or work with their counties so that, again, you know, you all can help them use the funds on projects. But I did want to point that out as well.